Camino84 here. This is going to be a little mix walkthrough video of one of the tracks on my album that's coming out in August. I'm going to walk you guys through a little bit of what this whole vintage emulation thing is about and sort of the approach I took to mixing the album and how you can dig in for yourself and play with some of this vintage modeling and emulation type stuff. So first things first, I'll play you guys a little bit of the track so you can hear what we're working with. You'll see I have all the plugins turned off for right now. So all you're going to hear is the basic mix just with the levels and the faders and the panning. So that's all you're hearing. Okay, so you get a little idea of what's going on there. A couple notes before we go any further. Some of these plugins and effects processing are going to be pretty subtle, and they might get lost in the YouTube compression as I upload this. So do what you can, listen with headphones, make sure you're watching in HD and all that good stuff, and listen carefully, and we'll try to walk through things. So first things first, there's a couple different levels of processing on each of these tracks here, whether it's the drums and the bass over here, the keys here in the pink, the guitars as played by Roller Girl here in green, and I have the breakdown section that you heard a little bit of at the end there in this purple. And you'll see there's 3 or 4 levels of processing on most tracks. The first for almost everything is you see VMR up here. That's Slate's virtual mix rack, and that's going to take care of emulating a console sound, and in this case we're using a Neve sound. You see the different options here could circle you through an SSL E desk, SSL G, an API desk, a Neve desk, a Trident, or an RC tube. And those are all just different brands of console that were used heavily in the 60s, 70s, and 80s on different recordings, and I played around with the different potential options for this song when I was first sitting down to mix it, and I decided I wanted to go with the Neve sound. So that's the first level of processing in most cases. The next level of processing in most cases is an EQ. And unlike your stock EQ in Ableton or Pro Tools, the difference here is that you're working with preset values. It's not a fully flexible EQ. This is how vintage equipment worked. You had sometimes much fewer selections than this. You'll see here this is a 4-band EQ. Plus we have the high pass and low pass filters, but you can't choose any value for frequencies, and you can't even choose the Q of each band. So vintage EQ, and this is the Waves VEQ4. This is modeling an old Neve EQ. The next level of processing on most of these tracks is a vintage compressor. I use a lot of different ones throughout this. Not all of them are Neve. Most of them are not Neve. There's a couple Neve models, but I use different compressors based on different instruments. We'll talk about that in just a second here. But this is where, like in an old recording studio, you would stop using the things built into the desk in many cases, and you would plug into outboard gear. So some desks, like the SSL desks or the API desks, and the Neve desks, they all have great built-in compressors that are good for different things, but sometimes when you want a certain sound, you would go the outboard gear. So as opposed to the EQs, where everyone's just using that Neve EQ on this track, you'll see a lot more variety in the types of compressors. And then sometimes there's a 4th plugin on the strip, another level of processing. We'll talk a little bit about those, but you don't see as many of them here. And then at the bottom of everything here, you see VTM, which is the Slate Virtual Tape Machine. And this is emulating a 16-track tape machine, just like you would be playing each individual channel off of in a vintage recording studio. You'll see a couple instances of Kramer tape instead, or Waves J37. On the guitars, just because I wanted a slightly different sound. Sometimes the Kramer and the J37 are more fun to play with if you're looking for a distorted sound or more saturation. So there's a couple instances of that, but for the most part, tape processing is the last thing on each channel. And then we have different buses and sends and 2 things on the master channel. We'll get to those in a bit, but let's start by just listening to some of the tracks. And I'll start by muting everything but the drums, and we'll listen to the drums for a minute. So a couple interesting things to note here. We're working with both live acoustic drums. So on the one playing drums here, these were recorded in a studio called The Record Company here in Boston. We got that. We've also got the electric bass in this section. And then we've got some drum loops. So let's quickly talk about, there's a couple things up here on this top line. First is waves in phase on the overheads. This isn't so much part of the vintage processing, but when you record live acoustic drums, sometimes the different microphones can get out of phase with each other, and you need to knock things back into place so that there's not phase cancellation and you're not ruining the transients or the body of the sound that the other mics picked up. So in this case, things were a little out of phase. I had to play with the delay here and invert the phase on the overhead. So I'm going to turn that back on. And actually, I'll give you a little comparison so you can hear what all these drum mics sound like when they're in phase versus out of phase. So you can hear as soon as I turn this plugin on, you can hear more of the low frequencies from the kick and the snare. The other thing I turned on the snare is a gate. So without the gate, you hear a lot of the hi-hat sounds and other sounds of the drum kit. And then with the gate on, you're only hearing the snare hit. This is just a stock Pro Tools plugin. You can really use anything to gate. And then on the bass guitar here, I'm using a guitar amp emulator. Gives it more of that amp sound, warms it up a little bit, gives it a little more drive, a little more harmonic distortion. So that's some of the initial processing in the drums there. There's really no other initial processing going on here except for on one of the keyboards I have a stereo imager just to make it a little wider. We don't really need to talk about that. I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. Let's listen to the mix as a whole, and we'll listen to what happens as soon as I turn on that console emulation, and it's as if we're running it through a Neve desk. So you'll hear an immediate difference as soon as I turn it all on. Everything will sound more full, a little brighter, and that's because what the console emulation is doing is adding all this harmonic distortion and sort of the imperfections that you would get in an analog desk. So let's take a listen. So you can already start to hear things popping out a little bit more and the mix sounding a little more cohesive as soon as I turn that on. It's subtle, but it's definitely real. I'll wait for this truck to drive past. Okay, they're doing some really freaking loud construction work outside my building, and I don't know if it'll start up again, but it just stopped. Anyways, so moving on to the EQ. Now, for most of the keyboards, since they weren't live instruments, or I liked the way they sounded already, and most of the guitars, really all I was using the EQ for was doing high-pass filters and low-pass filters. The main differences come in the drums and the bass, since those are, acoustic instruments. You see on the kick here, there's a number of things going on. Let me play that for you for a second, actually. So here's the kick without the EQ on. And what you're going to hear when I turn this on is, first off, filtering off some of the lowest stuff, a lot of the high stuff, boosting the foundational frequency quite a bit here, as close as I can get to it with the options on the Neve. Cutting out some of the boxiness in the middle by 2 decibels, and then some tiny, tiny boosts up top of just, half a decibel and 1 decibel to give it some definition. So check this out. So definitely gets rid of a lot of the junk that's already covered by other drum mics, and boosts up the tone of the kick. So here it is on the bass. You can see a similar thing here, cutting out a little bit of stuff and then just boosting up that foundation. Nothing up top. Getting it a little warmer, and then let's check out the snare. Oh wait, that's the distorted bass. Here's the snare. Let's check out the snare. You're going to see some filtering happening, boosting up that foundation, cutting out the boxiness. These are a little more drastic here. You're seeing boosts of 4 decibels, drops of 5, and then adding definition up top. So that's really adding a lot of definition. You get the basic idea of what I'm doing with these EQs. I'm selecting frequencies as closely as I can, making sure I'm using high-pass filtering and low-pass filtering on every channel, and then getting things to sound the way I want. So let's listen to the whole track with the EQs on and off. So you can hear as soon as I turn those EQs on, some of the drums and the bass come to the forefront. It's a much more focused sound. Some of the high-end junk is cut out. And now we're rocking with this. So just a second ago, sounded like this. And that's just with console emulation and EQs. So now moving on to compression, this is where things really start to shape up sound-wise, and there's a lot of different compressors, so I'm going to briefly cover them, and then we'll just do a big on-off, and we can hear the difference it adds. So on the drums, I really like using this API 2500 compressor, and I use this on the drums on almost every track of the album. You'll see I'm using a long attack time to let the transients of the drum through, and a pretty quick release time. Ratio's not crazy. I mean, it's not, if you were making future funk, you would use much higher ratios and more of a threshold, but we're really only looking for 2 or 3 decibels of gain reduction here. So even though this isn't a Neve brand, this is a different, brand different sound. At this point, this would be like using outboard gear in a vintage studio. So you'll see both the kick and the snare have that API 2500. I would usually use the same thing on the overheads like I do on the toms here, but in this case, since it has this sort of pop-punk-esque breakdown in the song, I wanted to get a really compressed, trashy, slammed sound from the cymbals. And no one does that better than Chris Lordalge. If you look at like his engineering credits on Discogs, you'll see like he sort of came up with that like grunge pop punk sound. So I'm using his Signature Series plugin here on the overheads. And let's just listen to the drums and show you the difference with the compressors on and off. You'll notice that the overheads are also getting a lot brighter. To be fair, there is some EQ and reverb processing going on here in the CLA plugin as well. But everything else gets a lot punchier. Then on the bass here, I have this LA2A compressor. This is a real classic. I use this on bass, I think, on almost every track on the album, if not every track. I also use it a lot on Rhodes and Wurlitzer electric pianos and on horns. It's an optical compressor. Basically anything that you want to sound warm, anything that has like inherent detail in the mid-range that you want to, bring out and showcase and not squash with a compressor. This is my go-to tool. It sounds fantastic. And let's just isolate the bass real quick. Yeah, real smooth. And then I'll give you the keys and the guitars with the compressors on and off as well. You'll see on the keys here, like I mentioned, on the Rhodes and the Wurlitzers, I like to use that LA2A. On keyboards or that are more like rhythmic, the CLA 76 is a great choice. Gives you a little more flexibility with attack and release times than the 2A does. And I like to use this on things that are primarily rhythmic in nature. And then on electric guitars, man, I'm big on the CLA 3A. You can't go wrong with this. This thing just sounds great on guitars. So almost all of Adam's guitar tracks have the 3A on it, with the exception of some stuff at the end that's just sustained chords. So I use the 2A. And on this sort of lead guitar track, I'm using the Waves V comp, which, just like the VEQ, this is modeling an old Neve compressor. So let's listen to the keys and guitars. You'll see the difference there is a lot more subtle when they're on versus off than it was with the drums. But it all sits in the mix so much nicer with the drums when everything's on. So let's listen to everything with and without the compressors. You'll hear some of the keyboards are a little overpowering, some of the guitars are sticking out, and the drums don't really cut through. All of a sudden, we have the drums come forward, we have some of the keyboards and guitars push back and sort of sit with each other nicely rhythmically. Really interesting. Starting to shape up the sound for sure. Now let's talk about the fourth level of processing on just a couple of these tracks. Here we have the V comp on the guitar. Let's just turn that on for now. And we'll talk about these three different plugins here going on in the drum section on this level. So on the kick, we're using another CLA signature plugin just to get a little... I wasn't happy with the kick sound after just the vintage EQ and the vintage compressor. So I turn this puppy on, and all of a sudden it's a lot clearer sound. You'll see I got a lot of treble and a lot of compression going on here to get a little more of that presence in the mix and really make it stick out. Well, sounds like the construction's starting up again. I'm going to pause this for a minute, see if that ends soon. Alright, sounds like the construction noise has died down for a bit. Let's see if I can crank out the end of this video here. So the next thing on the bass is a super cool plugin that I also probably use on every bass track and some other tracks. The Shep 73. Now this is modeling a different Neve EQ than the VEQ is. You'll see it's got knobs with lots of options. I mostly only use 2 knobs of this for bass tracks. And most other tracks. It sounds great when you use it to boost the lows, as I'm doing ever so slightly here, just like a half dB around 110. But this knob up here is my favorite. So this is controlling preamp drive. So if you want to like really harmonically distort something as if you were recording too loud, you can use this knob to do it. It's pretty subtle on the preamp setting, but once you turn the drive on, you can get these crazy great distortion sounds that I use a couple times on the record. So let's listen to just the bass, and I'll turn this on. So as the settings are right now, pretty subtle, but listen to how cool the distortion is if I chose to use the drive. Super, super cool sound. Probably my favorite distortion sound. I use it a couple times on the album, and the distorted bass in the breakdown section here totally has that on it, using that drive there, as well as the little bit of the low-end boosts there. And then I got Shep 73 on this fill channel here just to give it more drive. And then the last piece of processing here is just the Aphex Vintage Exciter. This just you know, adds a little extra harmonic distortion to the highs. If you ever use Isotope Ozone, you know what an exciter does. So I just got that on one of the drum loops here, give it a little more sparkle. And then the only other thing here is a reverb, bit of reverb on the keyboards. I'm using the Slate Verb Suite Classics in this case. I'm just going to turn that on. So listening to all the main processing, things are starting to shape up. Now I'm going to turn on the tape emulation. And this is going to add a whole nother layer of thickness and punch to the mix. There's a couple key settings. One is everything's set on machine type 2-inch 16 track, just like it would be in a real studio. We're imagining that we're recording each of these channels to a big piece of tape where it's all kept separately. The tape type, these are two different formulations of tape, and the speed is important too. And based on the combo of these two settings that you use, the harmonic distortion from the tape could be a little brighter, could be warmer, could muddy things up a little bit, could make them real crisp. So you'll see here, like on the bass, I'm using the 15 IPS speed, and I'm using this type of tape, and that's all about the warm sound. That's all about the low mids for sure. Whereas if you check on, let's see, what am I doing with guitars? On the guitars here, I've got the opposite settings here. I've got the tape that has slightly more high end, and I'm using the 30 IPS speed to make it more of a high end focus thing. And then, like I mentioned before, on the distorted guitars in the breakdown, I've got Kramer tape, just adding some noise, adding some wow and flutter, driving the playback level a little bit more, and I have J37 going on another one of Adam's like lead guitars in the main section here. So let's listen for a while with and without the tape emulation and check this out. So again, subtle, but you can hear the highs start to have more definition, the lows have more body, things get punchier, things get a little more cohesive. Now let's move on to some of these sends that I have here. For the most part, these fall into two categories. One is ER, for early reflections, and here I'm using the Waves reverb. I've turned the reverb off, but we're getting these different types of room responses where, you know, if these sounds were happening in a real room, the walls would reflect the sound in certain ways, and that's what these early reflections are. So I'm going to go through and turn them on gradually while we listen. I've got them on the breakdown. The guitars have their own early reflection, the keys have their own, and the drums have their own. Now they're mixed super low. This is more meant to be felt, not heard. So the way I mix these is I start with the volume knob at 0, I bring it down, and then I bring it back on just until I can tell a difference with it on versus off. So it might not be super audible, but still going to turn them on. Then the last thing that I have on the sends that'll be a lot more noticeable is parallel compression. So sent signals here, compress them super heavy. Like you'll see the drums get down to maybe 7 decibels of gain reduction. You'll see on the guitars here I'm using Kramer tape to really slam things. You'll see the record level's pretty high here, really going for a lot of tape saturation. Then on the breakdown, I'm using Waves Max Volume, which is a really cool plugin for loudness that combines low-level compression, high-level compression with a gate and a limiter. So I'm gonna go through and turn these on while we listen. You'll definitely hear a difference here. Things are gonna get a little louder and more forceful. Off. So again, these are mixed low. It's a subtle difference, but this is just getting some of that hyper compressed signal in there. Moving on, I've got these nice bus compressors on each group of tracks. These are pretty nice pieces of equipment. In old recording studios, they usually only had like one of these Puig Childs, and now in the software world, we can have multiple. So I'm using them to just sort of, get a little more cohesion in each group of instruments. And then finally, now that we've got a mix that's sounding pretty good, I've got Greg Wells Mixcentric. This is a one-knob plugin from Waves. It doesn't work on every track, but when it works really well. Obviously super easy to use, and this is just a sort of final touch on your mix to add some of Greg Wells' signature compression, excitement, harmonic distortion, stuff like that. So check this out. So obviously when I turned that intensity knob all the way up, it got way too bright for this particular track, but a little bit of it, really nice. So there you have it. That's basically the mix for this track. Not mastered. Obviously Amherst does a great job mastering my tracks. But I'll turn everything off, and then we'll do a quick listen through where I gradually turn it back on again. To recap, we've got a little bit of initial processing in some cases, but then it's all about emulating a console, emulating the EQs in that console, emulating vintage compressors. Sometimes then there's a little bit of additional processing. We've got tape emulation, just like things would happen in an old studio. We're using a little bit of early reflections to create a sense of depth and work on that 3D sound field, not have everything competing with each other, but some things sound farther back than others. We have parallel compression, give everything a little more body and punch, thicken up the mix. We've got bus compressors over here, just tiny bit of compression, 1 or 2 decibels tops on each group, just to get a little more cohesiveness. And then we've got Greg Wells Mixcentric rounding it all off. And just so you know what's here, this is just another console emulation. This isn't on, but this is just emulating the master channel of a console instead of one of the channel strips. So let's hit play and hear what it all sounds like. I guess that's it. There you have it. That's a bit of a mix walkthrough. This is one of the tracks from my album that's coming out in August, and an idea of how a basic mix with some analog vintage emulation works. Happy to answer any questions for you guys.